Derek Whitlow stood in the doorway of the home he and his wife had shared for 7 years and told her, in front of his own mother, that she had spent their entire marriage contributing essentially nothing, that he was tired of carrying her financially, and that she needed to pack a bag and figure out somewhere else to be by the end of the week. Maya Castellano did not argue with him. She did not raise her voice. She picked up her bag, and the only thing she said on her way out the door was that he should be careful what he said about who paid for what, because he genuinely had no idea. Derek worked as an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company called Ashcroft Holdings, a job he was proud of that paid considerably more than Maya's freelance consulting work appeared to, and that he had for years quietly used as evidence in his own mind that he was the marriage's real financial backbone. What Derek did not know, because he had never once asked Maya a direct question about the specific, often vague consulting work she described, was that Maya Castellano had personally acquired controlling ownership of Ashcroft Holdings 6 years earlier, and had been this entire time the person whose decisions ultimately determined whether Derek had a job to go to at all. This is the story of what happens when a man spends years measuring his wife's worth by a number he never actually verified, and what Maya did with that information once the marriage that had quietly protected Derek from ever finding out simply ceased to exist. It is also the story of exactly what Maya meant when she told him, on her way out the door, to be careful, because Maya Castellano was not a woman who said things like that without already knowing precisely what she intended to do next. Derek went to work 3 days after the eviction, expecting an ordinary Monday. He had no idea that Glenn Ashcroft, the company's founder, had already received a phone call from Maya the night before, a call that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with a decision Maya had actually been considering for almost a year. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we get to what Maya actually told Glenn on that call, I need you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything in this story is really an answer to one of them. First, how does a wife secretly own her husband's employer for 6 years without him noticing? Derek worked at Ashcroft Holdings for the entire span of his marriage to Maya. The ownership change happened a year into their relationship. We're going to show you exactly how Maya structured that acquisition to remain invisible to the one person who, on paper, had every reason to eventually find out. Second, what had Maya already been considering doing about Derek's role before the eviction? This isn't a story about Maya impulsively deciding to use her ownership against Derek the moment he humiliated her. Maya had been quietly thinking about something connected to Derek's position at the company for almost a year before that night, for reasons that, at the time, had nothing to do with revenge at all. And third, what did Maya actually say to Glenn Ashcroft that first phone call? Glenn Ashcroft had known the truth about Maya's ownership the entire time. What Maya told him in that first call, the night of the eviction, set in motion the specific sequence of events that determined exactly how this story ends for Derek, and it is not the sequence most people assume. One more thing before we go back to the beginning. Derek's mother, Paula, had told him more than once over the years that Maya's vague consulting work probably wasn't bringing in real money. Paula had no idea how close and how completely wrong that assumption actually was. Maya Castellano spent her 20s building a specialized operations consulting practice, working primarily with mid-sized manufacturing and logistics companies struggling with supply chain inefficiencies, work she was genuinely skilled at, and that, by her late 20s, had become substantially more lucrative than the modest, freelance-sounding description she gave most people who asked what she did for a living. By the time Maya was 31, 3 years before she met Derek, her consulting practice had generated enough sustained income and savings that she made her first small acquisition, a struggling regional trucking dispatch company she identified through her own consulting work, restructured over 18 months and sold at a substantial profit 2 years later. That first acquisition, conducted entirely before she met Derek, established both the financial foundation and the specific acquisition expertise that would later define her approach to Ashcroft Holdings. Maya has said, in limited subsequent comments about her own financial history, that she developed a habit early in her career of describing her work in deliberately modest, vague terms in social and personal contexts, a habit she attributed to several early professional experiences in which more specific descriptions of her income or acquisitions changed how people, particularly men in personal contexts, treated her in ways she found uncomfortable and ultimately decided to avoid by simply not inviting the conversation in the first place. That habit, formed years before she ever met Derek, would prove to be either the most fortunate or the most costly decision of her adult life, depending entirely on how the next 7 years unfolded. Maya met Derek Whitlow through a mutual friend's housewarming party, where Derek, then a rising operations supervisor at a different logistics company, struck her as genuinely hardworking, ambitious in a way she found admirable rather than off-putting, and refreshingly direct compared to several previous relationships she had found exhausting in their indirectness. Friends of the early relationship have consistently described Derek as attentive and supportive during the courtship and the first several years of marriage, with no indication during this period of the resentment that would eventually define the relationship's final stretch. Maya, by multiple accounts, described her work during this period in the same modest, deliberately vague terms she had used for years, terms Derek accepted without much follow-up curiosity in a pattern that would compound considerably over the following years. Derek proposed after roughly 18 months of dating, and the wedding, modest by both of their preferences and budgets, was funded largely through what appeared to Derek to be a combination of his own savings and a reasonable contribution from Maya, a financial picture that, at the time, looked exactly like what most people would assume. Two working professionals building a life together on comparable, if not identical, incomes. Derek had no way of knowing at the time of the wedding that Maya's actual net worth, built through her consulting practice and her first successful acquisition, already exceeded his own by a considerable margin. That gap would only widen, invisibly, over the following 6 years. Derek joined Ashcroft Holdings as an operations manager, roughly 1 year into his marriage to Maya, recruited from his previous logistics company by Regina Okafor, Ashcroft's chief operating officer, specifically for his strong operational track record, a hire that had absolutely nothing to do with Maya, who at that point had no connection to the company whatsoever, and who learned about Derek's new job the same way any supportive spouse would, with genuine excitement and congratulations. Separately, and through her own independent professional network entirely unconnected to Derek's new employer, Maya had begun preliminary conversations with Glenn Ashcroft approximately 8 months after Derek started at the company, after a mutual business contact suggested Maya's operational consulting expertise might be valuable to Glenn as he began considering his own retirement and succession options for the company he had built over 3 decades. Maya called Glenn Ashcroft that same night, from a hotel room she had booked roughly 20 minutes after leaving the house. A call Glenn has since described as notably calm and almost entirely focused on practical matters rather than anything resembling an emotional account of what had just happened. Maya told Glenn, according to his own account, given later during the company's internal handling of the situation, that her marriage had ended that evening, that she anticipated Derek would likely learn about her ownership of the company relatively soon, given the practical realities of an impending divorce, and that she wanted Glenn's guidance on how to manage that disclosure in a way that protected the company's stability and Derek's basic professional standing, rather than using her position to retaliate against him directly. Glenn has said this framing surprised him somewhat, given what Maya had just been through, and that he asked her directly whether she was certain she didn't want to simply terminate Derek's employment immediately, an option that was, practically speaking, entirely within her authority as controlling owner. Maya's response, according to Glenn, was that she had actually been considering a different and considerably more significant decision about Derek's role at the company for almost a year, entirely unrelated to anything happening in the marriage, and that the eviction had simply accelerated her timeline for addressing it rather than created the underlying issue in the first place. That pre-existing consideration, which had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with a specific professional concern Maya had been monitoring quietly for almost a year, is the detail that makes the rest of this story considerably more complicated than a simple tale of comeuppance. For nearly a year before the eviction, Maya, in her capacity as Ashcroft Holdings' controlling owner, reviewing quarterly operational reports through Regina Okafor, had been quietly tracking a specific pattern in Derek's department. a series of vendor contract decisions that, while not clearly improper on their face, showed a consistent pattern of favoring a particular logistics subcontractor whose pricing was modestly but consistently higher than competing options. A pattern Maya had flagged internally to Regina months earlier without yet taking any direct action. Regina's preliminary review, conducted carefully and without revealing the inquiry's connection to ownership-level concern, had identified that the subcontractor in question was owned by a college friend of Derek's, a relationship Derek had never formally disclosed through the company's standard vendor conflict of interest reporting process, despite policy requiring exactly that kind of disclosure for any vendor relationship involving a personal connection to the decision-maker. Maya has said she had been weighing for several months before the eviction exactly how to handle this finding, specifically whether it represented a genuine, intentional conflict of interest violation warranting formal action, or a more ambiguous situation where Derek had simply failed to recognize an old, distant friendship as something requiring formal disclosure, a distinction that mattered enormously to her, both as a careful business owner and, separately and with considerable internal conflict, as Derek's wife. The eviction did not create this professional concern, but it fundamentally changed the calculation Maya had been making about how much benefit of the doubt exactly she owed Derek going forward, both as a husband and now, suddenly and unavoidably, as an employee whose conduct she was already specifically reviewing. Within a week of the eviction, Maya, working through Regina and the company's outside counsel, rather than taking any direct, visible action herself, authorized a formal, comprehensive review of the vendor relationship Regina had flagged months earlier, a decision Maya has said she made specifically to ensure the process would be conducted according to the same standards the company would apply to any employee, rather than shaped by anything connected to her personal relationship with Derek. Maya specifically instructed Regina and outside counsel that she wanted to be kept informed of the investigation's findings but wanted no direct role in determining its outcome, a deliberate structural safeguard she insisted upon, according to Regina's later account, specifically because she recognized the obvious appearance problem of personally directing consequences against an employee she had just evicted from her own home days earlier. Derek, meanwhile, went to work the following Monday with no knowledge of any of this, operating under the continued assumption that his job, his standing at Ashcroft Holdings, and his financial position relative to Maya remained exactly what he had always believed them to be. Derek would not learn the truth about Maya's ownership or about the vendor investigation already quietly underway through any direct conversation with Maya at all. He would learn it the way most people in this kind of story eventually do, through a piece of information reaching him sideways from someone who had no idea of the complete picture either. Derek learned about Maya's ownership of Ashcroft Holdings 12 days after the eviction, through a conversation with a colleague who had, entirely independently of anything connected to Derek's marriage, encountered a piece of internal company documentation listing Castellano Strategic Partners as the entity requiring sign-off on a budget request the colleague was processing, and who, recognizing Maya's last name from a company holiday party Derek had brought her to years earlier, asked Derek directly, with no idea of the personal context, whether his wife was somehow connected to company ownership. Derek's first response, according to the colleague, was confused dismissal, since he had no framework whatsoever for why his wife's name would appear on internal ownership documentation. That confusion resolved into something considerably more serious within the same conversation. Once Derek began asking follow-up questions, and the colleague, now uncertain whether he had said something he shouldn't have, suggested Derek simply ask Regina directly. Derek requested a meeting with Regina Okafor that same afternoon, a meeting Regina had been specifically prepared for, given Maya's earlier instructions about managing the eventual disclosure carefully and without retaliation, but which Derek experienced by his own later account as one of the most disorienting professional conversations of his entire career. Regina confirmed plainly and without elaboration, beyond what was necessary, that Maya Castellano was indeed Ashcroft Holdings' controlling owner, and had been for nearly 6 years. Derek's first question, according to Regina's account, was not about the company at all. Derek's first question to Regina, according to her account, was not about his job security or about the scale of Maya's wealth, but simply how long has she known. Regina told him honestly and without softening it that Maya had known since before Derek was ever hired, since the acquisition itself had occurred only a year after the marriage began and several years before Derek had ever applied to the company. Derek has since acknowledged in a conversation referenced during the company's internal handling of the broader situation that this specific detail that Maya had known the entire time he worked there, through every promotion, every confident comment he made about his own financial contributions to the marriage, was considerably more disorienting to him than the wealth disparity itself, because it meant nearly every professional conversation and personal financial argument of his marriage had taken place with Maya, holding information that fundamentally reframed all of it, information she had simply chosen, consistently, not to share. Regina, who had maintained the confidentiality arrangement for years specifically because Maya had asked her to, has said she felt genuine sympathy for Derek's disorientation in that meeting, while also recognizing that the situation he was confronting was, in significant part, the predictable consequence of years of his own incurious assumptions about his wife's finances. Assumptions Maya had never actively encouraged so much as simply never corrected. Derek left that meeting with two separate, overlapping crises to process: the personal reality of what his marriage had actually been, and a professional reality he did not yet fully understand, was also already in motion. The formal vendor investigation, completed roughly 3 weeks after it began and conducted by outside counsel with Regina's operational support, concluded that Derek had failed to disclose his personal friendship with the subcontractor's owner across at least 4 separate contract decisions over the preceding 2 years. A clear violation of the company's standard conflict of interest policy, though the investigation found no direct evidence that Derek had personally profited financially from the arrangement, beyond the ordinary benefit of awarding contracts to a friend's company over equally qualified competitors. The investigation determined that the pricing discrepancy, while real, was modest enough in scale that it did not rise to the level of clear financial misconduct, meriting immediate termination on its own, but that the consistent failure to disclose a known conflict of interest relationship across multiple contract cycles represented a genuine policy violation requiring formal consequence under the company's existing disciplinary framework, applied exactly as it would be for any employee in a comparable position. Maya, true to the structural safeguard she had insisted upon from the beginning, was not directly involved in determining Derek's specific consequence, which was instead decided by Regina and the company's HR director according to standard policy, resulting in a formal written disciplinary action, a mandatory ethics retraining requirement, and a probationary period, during which Derek's contract decisions would require additional management review, a serious but notably proportionate consequence, considerably short of termination. Derek has since acknowledged, somewhat reluctantly, that this outcome was fairer and more measured than he expected, given everything else happening simultaneously in his life. What he did not yet know was that Maya had made one additional decision, separate entirely from the company's disciplinary process, that would determine the actual final outcome of his employment at Ashcroft Holdings. Approximately 5 weeks after the eviction, Maya requested a single direct meeting with Derek, held at a neutral location with no connection to either the marriage or the company. A meeting she initiated specifically because she had reached a personal decision she wanted to communicate to him directly rather than through Regina, HR, or any formal company channel. Maya told Derek, according to his own subsequent account, that she had no intention of using her ownership position to terminate his employment beyond whatever consequence the formal disciplinary process had already determined was appropriate, because doing so, she told him, would mean letting her personal anger about the marriage's end shape a decision that should be governed by the company's actual policies and his actual professional conduct, a distinction she said mattered enormously to her, both as a business owner and as someone trying to leave the marriage with her own integrity intact. She told him further that she had genuinely considered, for several days after the eviction, simply terminating him outright, an option she acknowledged would have been emotionally satisfying in the moment, but that she had ultimately concluded that doing so would prove something about her own character she did not want proven. regardless of how badly Derek had behaved on the night he ended their marriage. Derek asked her, near the end of that conversation, why she had never told him the truth at any point during their 7 years of marriage, a question he had been turning over since his meeting with Regina weeks earlier. Maya's answer was the most direct and unguarded thing she had said to him since the eviction. Maya told Derek that she had developed her habit of describing her work modestly years before she ever met him, as a way of protecting herself from a pattern she had observed too many times in her professional and personal life. People, particularly men, treating her differently, and often worse, once they understood the actual scale of what she had built. She told him she had genuinely hoped, in the early years of their marriage, that this habit would simply become unnecessary over time, that he would come to value her for reasons that had nothing to do with money either way. Maya told Derek that the specific tragedy of their marriage, in her own assessment, was not that she had hidden her wealth from him, but that her habit of staying quiet about it had given him room, year after year, to construct an entire incorrect narrative about their relative contributions to the marriage, a narrative he had never once tested by simply asking her a direct, specific question about her finances, the same way he had also never disclosed his own friendship with a vendor he was awarding contracts to. She told him that both of their failures, in the end, came from the same root, a willingness to let convenient assumptions stand in for actual honesty, for years, because honesty would have required more effort and more vulnerability than either of them wanted to risk. Derek did not have an immediate response to this. Maya has said the silence that followed was the most honest moment of their entire 7 years together. The divorce proceedings, conducted over the following several months, were complicated considerably by the discovery of Maya's actual financial position, requiring a far more extensive asset disclosure and valuation process than either party had initially anticipated when Derek first filed the paperwork shortly after the eviction. Under the assumption, by his own later admission, that the division would be relatively straightforward, given what he believed was a fairly modest combined marital estate. Maya's attorneys structured the settlement discussions around a clear, well-documented distinction between assets accumulated before the marriage, including her original consulting practice income and the proceeds from her first acquisition, which remained legally separate property under the relevant state's marital law, and the comparatively modest joint assets the couple had accumulated together during the marriage itself, which were divided according to standard equitable distribution principles. Derek's attorney, once the full financial picture became clear, advised him that contesting the separate property characterization aggressively was unlikely to succeed and would primarily increase legal costs without materially changing the outcome. The divorce was finalized roughly 7 months after the eviction, with a settlement that gave Derek a fair division of the marriage's joint assets, but no claim whatsoever on Maya's pre-existing wealth or her ownership of Ashcroft Holdings, an outcome Derek has since described, with some difficulty, as fair according to the actual facts, even though it was considerably less than what he had once assumed. With total confidence, his financial position within the marriage entitled him to. Derek remained employed at Ashcroft Holdings throughout the divorce process, under the probationary terms the vendor investigation had established, a daily professional reality several colleagues described as visibly difficult for him to navigate. Derek's continued employment at Ashcroft Holdings during and after the divorce proceedings was, by his own account and corroborated by colleagues, genuinely uncomfortable in ways that had little to do with any direct mistreatment and everything to do with the simple, unavoidable knowledge that his professional standing now existed within a structure ultimately controlled by his ex-wife, a reality he had to navigate daily, in meetings, in performance reviews, and in the ordinary texture of office life, without any of his colleagues beyond Regina and a small number of senior leaders ever directly acknowledging it. Derek has said he considered resigning multiple times during this period, but ultimately concluded, after his probationary period ended without further incident, roughly 4 months after it began, that leaving a job he was genuinely good at, specifically to avoid the discomfort of his ex-wife's ownership, would represent a kind of defeat he wasn't yet ready to accept, particularly given that Maya had, by every account, scrupulously avoided using her position to make his continued employment more difficult than the formal disciplinary consequences already had. Regina has said Derek's performance during this period actually improved noticeably, a change she attributed, in conversations with colleagues, to the combination of closer management scrutiny following the vendor finding and what she described as a kind of humbled recalibration in how Derek approached his work generally, following the disorientation of the preceding months. Derek remained at Ashcroft Holdings for an additional 14 months before making a decision that several colleagues described as the first fully independent professional choice he had made since the entire situation began. Derek left Ashcroft Holdings roughly 14 months after the divorce was finalized, accepting a position at a competing logistics firm that represented, by every external measure, a genuine professional step forward, rather than a lateral or diminished move. A detail Derek has said mattered enormously to him, because he wanted his eventual departure to be clearly understood, by himself if no one else, as a choice made from professional ambition rather than from an inability to continue functioning in a workplace controlled by his ex-wife. Derek told a former colleague, in a conversation shared afterward, that the entire experience, however painful, had forced him to examine a pattern in his own character he had never previously been required to confront. A tendency to construct confident narratives about his own circumstances based on incomplete information, simply because the incomplete version was more comfortable or more flattering than the work of asking direct, sometimes uncomfortable questions and actually listening to the answers. He has said he has tried, in the time since, to apply that lesson more broadly in his life, with what he describes as mixed but genuine effort, acknowledging that recognizing a pattern in retrospect is considerably easier than consistently avoiding it going forward. Maya has said, in the time since the divorce was finalized, that she has worked deliberately to resist a simple, satisfying narrative in which she emerges from the marriage as a clear victor and Derek as a clear, deserved loser. Finding that framing, however emotionally tempting in the immediate aftermath of the eviction, ultimately too simple to account for her own role in how the marriage's final years actually unfolded. Maya has acknowledged directly that her years-long habit of describing her finances modestly, while never technically dishonest, functioned, in practice, as a kind of passive concealment that gave Derek's incorrect assumptions room to grow unchecked for years, and that a different kind of marriage, built on more consistent direct honesty from the beginning, might never have arrived at the eviction at all. She has said she does not regret protecting her own privacy and autonomy throughout her adult life, but has genuinely reconsidered whether the specific habits that served her well in casual social contexts were ever well suited to an actual marriage. She has since made a deliberate, considered change in how she approaches financial disclosure in her current relationship, choosing, with a new partner she began seeing roughly a year after the divorce, to be direct and specific about her financial position relatively early. A change she has described as uncomfortable, but, in her own assessment, considerably healthier than the pattern she maintained for 7 years with Derek. Maya, now well over a year removed from the eviction, has continued her involvement with Ashcroft Holdings in largely the same structural role she has maintained for years, though she has made one notable change. Following the events of this story, and after extensive conversation with Glenn Ashcroft and Regina Okafor, she chose to become a publicly acknowledged owner of the company internally, ending the confidentiality arrangement that had protected her privacy for 6 years, but that she ultimately concluded had outlived its original, reasonable purpose. Maya has said the decision was driven less by anything connected to Derek specifically, and more by a broader recognition that maintaining significant structural secrecy, even for entirely defensible original reasons, had created exactly the kind of conditions that made the entire situation with Derek possible in the first place, and that she preferred, going forward, to manage the genuine complications of visible ownership directly rather than continue managing the considerably less visible but ultimately more costly complications of sustained concealment. Under this more visible structure, Ashcroft Holdings has continued operating successfully, with Regina Okafor's day-to-day leadership largely unchanged and Glenn Ashcroft remaining involved as a minority shareholder and advisor. A continuity several employees have said reassured them considerably once Maya's ownership became generally known within the company. This story gets remembered, when people share it, as a story about a man who humiliated his wife and discovered, catastrophically, that she secretly owned the company that paid his salary. And it is that. But I think the more interesting story underneath it is about the specific mutual cost of a marriage in which both partners, in different ways, chose convenient, incomplete information over the harder, more vulnerable work of direct honesty. Derek, in his unverified assumptions about Maya's finances and his own undisclosed friendship with a vendor, and Maya in her years-long habit of describing her actual circumstances in deliberately modest, incomplete terms. And I think what makes this story more than a simple tale of comeuppance is the fact that Maya's own reflection, once the immediate satisfaction of the reveal had passed, refused to let her off the hook entirely either. She built real, independent success through genuine skill and discipline, and she had every right to protect her privacy and her autonomy throughout her adult life. But the specific way she protected it inside her own marriage, year after year, created exactly the kind of informational vacuum that allowed Derek's resentment to grow unchecked, until it finally erupted in the cruelest possible way, in front of his own mother, aimed at a woman who had, the entire time, been quietly holding more of the marriage's actual foundation than he ever understood. The question this story ultimately leaves you with is not really about money or about who deserved what in the divorce settlement. It is about what we actually owe the people closest to us, in terms of honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable, even when staying quiet feels safer or simpler in the moment, because the alternative, as this story shows clearly, is allowing the people who matter most to build their entire understanding of you and of your marriage on assumptions neither of you ever bothered to test. There's a photograph from Ashcroft Holdings' company-wide meeting, held shortly after Maya's ownership became publicly known internally, taken without her fully realizing it at the time. In it, Maya stands at the front of a conference room, mid-sentence, addressing the assembled staff directly for the first time as their acknowledged owner, rather than an invisible presence behind the scenes, her expression focused and engaged, rather than guarded. She has said it remains one of her favorite photographs from the entire period, not because of what it represents about the company, but because of how unfamiliar and, ultimately, how genuinely freeing it felt to simply be seen clearly, in a room full of people, for exactly who she actually was. Before we go, I want to ask you something, because I think this story raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and I'd rather hear your honest take than offer a tidy one myself. Maya never lied to Derek about her finances. She simply described them, consistently, in deliberately modest and incomplete terms, for reasons that long predated their marriage and had genuine, defensible roots in her own past experience. I want to ask you directly, does that kind of sustained, technically truthful vagueness carry a meaningful share of responsibility for what eventually happened in this marriage? Or do you think the entire burden of verifying basic facts about your own spouse's finances rests with the person who simply chose, for years, never to ask a direct question? Tell me where you land in the comments. I suspect the answer reveals something about how each of us draws the line between privacy and honesty in our own closest relationships. And if this story made you think about the specific difference between protecting your privacy and quietly allowing someone else's incorrect assumptions to stand uncorrected, you'll want to see what we're covering next week. Because next week we're telling the story of two business partners, friends for over 20 years, who discovered, only after one of them tried to sell his half of the company, that their original founding agreement had been quietly altered years earlier in a way only one of them had ever known about. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We post a new true story every week. I'm your narrator. This has been Tales of Whisper. Before you decide exactly how much someone has contributed to your life, it might be worth asking them directly. The answer might be considerably more than you ever assumed. Tales of Whisper, storytelling for the curious mind.